You have probably seen the story about the guard they called the hyena of Auschwitz, the whip, the trial, the rope. That story gets told again and again. But there is another story from the same camp system almost nobody tells. 74 young women the SS did not register as people. They registered them as rabbits, not because they were fast, because of how they had to move after what was done to them in one hospital block at Ravensbrück. To understand what happened to them, you have to understand the camp itself. Ravensbrück sat in a swamp 50 miles north of Berlin, and it was the only major concentration camp the Nazis built specifically for women. It was designed to hold 6,000 prisoners. By the end of the war, it had processed well over 100,000 people from more than 20 countries. About 1 in 5 of them were Jewish, and tens of thousands never left the camp alive. When the Gestapo began rounding up members of the Polish resistance after the invasion of Poland, the women they captured, students, scouts, couriers for the underground, were funneled into this one camp. Among them were 74 young Polish political prisoners, most still in their teens and 20s. The youngest was only 16. They had no idea that the camp hospital, the place meant to treat the sick, was about to become the site of one of the most disturbing medical programs of the entire war. However, in late 1942, prisoners were ordered to stay away from a section of the hospital block while new equipment was installed. Nobody told them why. They would find out soon enough. The order had come from the very top. Heinrich Himmler wanted to know whether a new class of drugs, sulfonamides, could save German soldiers dying of gangrene on the Eastern Front. Therefore, his personal physician, an SS surgeon named Karl Gebhardt, needed test subjects whose wounds he could control completely. He chose the women of Ravensbrück. Gebhardt would later be tried and executed for these crimes, but that was still years away. The procedure was always the same. Surgeons cut into a prisoner's leg, usually the calf, and packed the open wound with bacteria, glass shards, wood splinters, or rust, anything that would mimic a real battlefield injury. Some wounds were treated with the new sulfa drugs. Others were left as a control group, deliberately untreated, so doctors could compare the results. Almost none of it was done under proper anesthesia. The women described being awake or only half sedated, while their legs were cut open and packed with infectious material. The SS chief medical officer who toured the ward afterward complained that the results did not look realistic enough, because none of the women had actually died on a battlefield. This is where the nickname came from. After surgery, many of the women could no longer walk normally. Their legs were swollen, infected, and bound in heavy plaster casts, so the only way to get around the ward was to hop. The guards started calling them Krolki, rabbits, and for some of them, one operation was never enough. SS doctors operated on certain prisoners again and again, sometimes as many as 8 separate times, to keep testing new combinations of drugs and surgical techniques. Later rounds of operations went even further, deliberately breaking bones and grafting pieces of bone from one woman onto another, just to see what the body would do. Barbara Pietrzyk was 16 years old, the youngest of all 74. In 1942 alone, she was operated on 5 times. Surgeons cut into her leg, infected it, let it fester, then cut into it again. By the time the experiments ended, she was left with permanent paralysis in her leg. She survived the camp. However, the damage done to her body in that hospital block never fully healed. And in 1947, 2 years after the war ended, Barbara Pietrzyk died from the long-term consequences of those operations. She was 22 years old. Do the math on what that program actually cost. 74 women went through these experiments between 1942 and 1943. 5 of them died almost immediately, deliberately infected with bacterial strains so aggressive that survival was never the point. 6 more were executed afterward, because the SS doctors decided their usefulness as test subjects had ended, and they knew too much to be allowed to live as ordinary prisoners. That left 63 survivors, young women carrying permanently damaged legs, missing muscle, exposed bone, and scars that would never close properly for the rest of their lives. And this was happening inside a system that at the very same time was training roughly 3,500 female SS overseers who went on to run the rest of the camp network. The same gates that produced guards like the ones you have heard about in other videos also produced this. Two completely different fates, generated by the exact same machine, on the exact same patch of land north of Berlin. However, these women did not simply accept what was happening to them. In March 1943, a group of the rabbits did something almost unimaginable given their position. They wrote a formal letter of protest to the camp commandant, Fritz Suren, asking directly whether he knew that prisoners were being operated on without their consent, and pointing out that even international law forbade experimental surgery on political prisoners. Dozens of them signed it, knowing exactly what retaliation they risked. Therefore, they were not just victims. They were documenting a crime in real time from inside the crime itself. And they went further. Several of the women began writing secret letters using the only ink available to them, their own urine, which becomes visible on paper after it dries and is heated. These letters describe the operations in detail, named the doctors involved, and were smuggled out of the camp piece by piece. Eventually, they reached the Polish underground resistance network, and from there, the Polish government in exile in London. For the first time, people outside the barbed wire had documented proof of what was happening inside Ravensbrück's hospital block. But the most dramatic moment came right at the end. By early 1945, the Soviets were closing in, and the SS began trying to erase evidence of what had happened at Ravensbrück. On February 4th, word reached the camp's underground network that the SS planned to murder the remaining rabbits during the next selection, to make sure none of them survived to testify. Therefore, the International Prisoners of Ravensbrück organized overnight one of the most coordinated rescue operations of the entire camp system. While the surviving rabbits stayed up writing goodbye letters to their families, fellow prisoners built hiding places, swapped identities, and physically pulled women out of the lineup during roll call, right in front of the SS guards. And it worked. For nearly 3 months, the rabbits were hidden, moved, and protected by other prisoners, right under the noses of the men who wanted them dead, until Soviet forces finally reached the camp in late April 1945. However, surviving the camp was not the end of their story. 4 of the rabbits later traveled to Nuremberg, where they testified against the doctors who had operated on them, becoming some of the most powerful witnesses in what became known as the doctors' trial. But most of them went home to Poland with permanently damaged legs and no support, no recognition, and in many cases, no way to pay for the reconstructive surgery they needed. Therefore, it took until the late 1950s, more than a decade later, for an American activist named Carolyn Faraday to learn their story and convince a journalist to write about it. Donations poured in, and a group of the surviving rabbits were finally flown to the United States for reconstructive surgery on injuries the Nazis had inflicted on them as teenagers. One of the rabbits, Wanda Poltowska, lived to be over 100 years old, carrying the memory of that hospital block for the rest of her long life. For some of these women, the darkest fate wasn't dying inside Ravensbrück. It was surviving it, and then waiting 15 years for anyone outside Poland to even acknowledge what had been done to their bodies. That's the story almost nobody tells. Subscribe for the histories the textbooks skip.